What's up guys, Zack Schnepf here, and today I'm going to take you through my 5 tips in Lightroom to improve your landscape photos fast. But first, coffee. It's so good when I touch your lips. Before we jump into Lightroom, I want to say that there's only so much that photo editing software or post-processing software can do for you, and you really want to start out with the best raw material that you can. So that means good field technique, getting your settings right in your camera, getting a good, at least a decent exposure, shooting in good light, using a tripod, polarizer, or what have you, so you get the best raw material to start with. And then editing software like Lightroom, Photoshop, whatever, is going to really take that already good photograph and take it to the next level and make it a great photograph. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into Lightroom and talk about my 5 tips for how to improve your landscape photos fast. And here we are in Lightroom. Lightroom is an incredible piece of photo editing software. It's incredibly powerful, very intuitive, and you're working with the raw pixel data, so you can really edit quite a bit, and it's going to retain the maximum image quality. So let's get right into it, and I'll go into the develop module here, and let's start with tip 1. And tip 1 is some targeted tonality adjustments using the most powerful tools available to you here in Lightroom. So the first thing I'm going to do is head into this basic tab here, and I'm going to do a little bit of highlight and shadow recovery. So if you watch the histogram, you can watch the tonality change as I make these adjustments. I'm going to grab the highlight slider first and pull it to the left. You can see it's pulling information out of those highlight tones. And then I'll grab the shadow slider, pull it to the right, and I'll open up those shadows. You can see you can go way too far with this. So I'm going to use kind of an appropriate amount of shadow recovery. That looks pretty good. And I'm just looking for a good starting point with the most information available in those shadow tones and those highlight tones. And once I have the highlights and shadow slider set, I'm going to move down to the tone curve panel here. The sliders here in the tone curve panel are a great way to make targeted tonality adjustments to different tonalities in the image. So if you just use the contrast slider up in the basic tab, yes, it will increase contrast, but it's a very general amount of contrast, and that means it's going to add an equal amount of brightness and darkness to the image to increase that contrast. If you use the sliders in the tone curve panel, you just have a little bit more control. You can add a little bit more on the light side, so I can pull this lights up and maybe preserve some of the shadows, so only maybe do a little bit of contrast enhancement with the dark tones here. Really, it's just having that level of control and targeting each tonality with these sliders. So you can see I can grab this highlight slider, you can pull it down even further or pull it back up. Since I just recovered those, I'm going to leave that neutral. And same with those shadows as well. I don't want to lose the detail that I just recovered. But I do want to add a little bit here in the darks maybe. We'll increase that contrast. Again, not too much. I'm going to be pretty conservative here until later. So we'll come back to this tip number 1 at the end of this after I've showed you all 5 tips to do a little bit more adjustment. But this is a good starting point. Alright, let's move on to tip number 2. And tip number 2 is the HSL panel here. HSL stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminance. And this is where I come to make all of my color adjustments, whether I'm going to shift a hue or saturate individual colors, or darken individual colors as well. You can do all of that here in the HSL panel. So let's start with hue. You can see you have all these sliders here, and they're all attached to their individual colors that they'll affect. So if I grab the blue slider down here, for instance, and I pull it to the left, you can see I can add some cyan or shift that blue hue towards cyan, or I can shift it toward magenta a little bit. And I tend to like to richen up my blues with a little bit of magenta, so I tend to pull it to the right a little bit. And we can do the same thing with the yellows here. There's definitely some yellows here in the clouds, so if I grab this yellow slider, pull it to the left, I can add some orange, or if I pull it the other way, I can neutralize some of that orange and go more towards green and shift that yellow hue. I tend to like it, again, more towards the orange side, so I'm going to just move it a little bit to the left. There's also some oranges in here, and you can shift those more towards red, or again, neutralize them more towards yellow. I'm going to leave them pretty much where they are. Next up, red slider. There's not a whole lot of actually true red in this image, so this isn't going to do anything. Same with something like purple. Since there are no purples in this image, this slider won't do anything. So you can see these hue sliders are a great way to shift colors in different directions to kind of optimize each color and kind of tweak colors in any way you want. Next up is saturation. This is not a part of the panel that I use very often. I don't usually saturate individual colors. Every once in a while I'll desaturate the blues, because a lot of times once I do some contrast adjustments, the blues get maybe a little bit too saturated, and I can come in here, grab the blue slider, pull it to the left, and desaturate it. But I don't do a whole lot here, so I'm going to move on to the Luminance tab. So let's jump into the Luminance tab here. And this is actually a pretty powerful area and part of this HSL panel. I can grab this blue slider and I can simulate the effect that a polarizer would have. If I grab this blue slider and pull it to the left to darken those blue tones, you can see it targets just the blue hue, and it darkens that color. It's a pretty incredible ability and a very powerful tool. You can definitely overdo it. I tend to be pretty conservative with this as well, but it is a really nice tool and something to experiment with for sure. And if I move up to the yellow slider, I can choose to either darken or lighten some of those yellow tones up in the clouds as well. I kind of like them maybe just a little bit darker, so I'll just add maybe a little bit of luminance adjustment there, and same with the oranges as well. That looks pretty good. But you can see the incredible amount of control that this gives you. Being able to target those different colors and change the luminance based on those colors is a very powerful tool. And again, all of these different tabs make the HSL panel an incredibly powerful set of tools for any color adjustments. Okay, let's move on to tip number 3. For tip number 3, I'm going to move all the way down to the effects panel, all the way down here, and the dehaze slider. The dehaze slider attempts to remove haze, or the appearance of haze, from your image. The way it does that is it increases mid-tone contrast. So if I pull it to the right, you can see it increases that mid-tone contrast and removes the appearance of haze. If I pull it to the left, it decreases that mid-tone contrast and definitely washes out the image. You can see there is a little bit of haze maybe up towards the mountain, but there's not a whole lot in this image. This is a pretty clear day up at Mount Hood. So I'll just dial in maybe a little bit of dehaze. You do want to be pretty conservative with this. You can see you can go way too far. The image gets pretty funky and it starts falling apart and you lose image quality. It also gives it kind of a blue cast. So again, I try to be kind of conservative. I usually try to stay below 30, and in this case, I'll keep it below 20, maybe in the teens. But it is a nice way to increase that mid-tone contrast, and if you do have some haze issues in an image, it's a great way to remove some of that haze. Alright, I think that looks good, so let's move on to tip number 4. And tip number 4 is using the dust spot removal tool up here at the top. If I click on the dust spot removal tool here, and I click on this little box over here to visualize, you can see it gives us, brings up this visualizer, which is really handy for finding dust spots. So if I turn this back off, you can also toggle this with A on your keyboard. And you can see without this on, it's really hard to see where those dust spots are. But with the visualizer turned on, it's really easy to find these spots. You just click on them, and what it does is it attempts to clone from a nearby area that has the same texture and color. So I'll go around and find some of the worst dust spots here and get rid of them. You can also click and drag if you have kind of like a hair on there or a longer dust spot. You can also change where this clones from by clicking this target area and moving it somewhere else. So let me just get kind of the worst of these dust spots. And that looks pretty good. I'll toggle it on and off just to see how it's looking, and looks a lot better. So I'll pretend I got all of them, and then you hit done. And there you go. All those dust spots gone. This is one of my favorite tools in Lightroom. I used to do all of my dust spot removal in Photoshop, but they kept adding functionality and adding that visualizer to Lightroom, and now I do all my dust spot removal in Lightroom, except for maybe some really weird trouble areas that I might have to take care of in Photoshop. Alright, let's move on to tip number 5. And tip number 5 is going to be using these adjustment tools. So the adjustment brush and the adjustment gradient tool or gradient filter. These are very powerful tools, and these tools simulate things that you could only do before in Photoshop. They simulate masking and selections. So these are very powerful tools, and nice to see them in Lightroom, adding some of that functionality to bring it closer to what you can do in Photoshop. So let's jump right in, and I'll demonstrate how I like to use these tools. So I'll start with the gradient filter, and let me reset these parameters here and these values. What I want to do is darken the sky and darken this reflection a little bit with the gradient filter here. So I'm going to pull down the exposure maybe like 3/4 of a stop or so, and then I'll come up here and drag down a gradient over the sky, and you can see you can adjust this as needed. And my favorite part of these tools, you can do this with the gradient filter or the adjustment brush or any of these tools, is you can go down to this range mask and you can choose luminance. So as you can see, if I mouse over this range mask, you can see it says change luminance range. So what this slider does effectively is chooses the luminance values that you want included and excluded from this adjustment. So if I grab this left slider here, which represents the darker tones, and I move it to the right, I'm basically telling the program that I don't want this particular adjustment to affect those darker tones. So once I've got the range mask dialed in, let's add another gradient tool down to the reflection here. So I'll click and drag this up. I don't want this one quite as strong as the one I added on the sky, so I'm going to reduce the amount of exposure darkening. So I'll just pull it to the right, just want a little bit of darkening down there to kind of match the tonal values in the sky. Okay, those look pretty good. Let's move on to the adjustment brush. So the adjustment brush here, very powerful tool, and you can see it gives us this brush, and again you have the same controls here. You can control any one of these parameters, just like the gradient filter. And in this case, I'm going to reset the exposure value, and I'm going to increase the contrast and actually increase the exposure a little bit. So my idea is I want to paint over this reflection and up here in the sky to help brighten up some of those tones again, and with this adjustment brush make some targeted changes to just these areas. And that's the beauty of this tool, is it allows you to make targeted changes to specific areas in the image. So let's paint over the reflection here. That looks good. And then let's do the same thing up here in the sky. Once I have those brush strokes recorded, I can then go in and edit these values to adjust this to taste. So I can increase the contrast or pull up the exposure more or less. Just kind of dial it in so it looks the way I want it to look. So that looks pretty good. And if I mouse over this, it will show you kind of a mask view of where you brush that on the image. And you can see I missed a spot up here. So I can go back over that if I wanted to. And let's mouse over that again. There you go, that looks pretty good. So you can see if I click on this little toggle down here, I can toggle on and off what the effect that adjustment brush is having. And that looks pretty good. But let's say I wanted to remove the effect up here in the sky. I didn't like how light this cloud was or something. What you can do is you can head over here and click on the erase, and you can change the radius of your brush by using these square bracket keys on your keyboard, which is pretty handy. And what you can do is, if I go over this area up here, I can erase the adjustment effect that was having before. I actually think I liked it better before, but you can see you can have that level of control where you can mask out an area that you overlapped or something. But let me undo that because I liked it better before. But there you go. You can see the adjustment brush and all of these different adjustment tools. Very powerful, and again, they do simulate masking and selections in Photoshop. You don't quite have the same level of control, but it is amazing the amount of control that you can have and how sophisticated these tools have become with each iteration of Lightroom. So once I'm finished making all those different adjustments, let's take a look at before and after. So if I hit the / key on my keyboard, this will show before I made the adjustments and after. That's looking pretty good. But usually once I make these adjustments, I like to go back, let me hit done to finalize those adjustments. And I want to go back to this basic tab. So now I'm going to go in and fine tune some of these tonality adjustments that we did in tip number 1. So I'm going to go and actually add a little bit more shadow recovery in the shadows, and maybe even a little bit more highlight recovery as well. And after I do that, I'm going to pull up the exposure just a little bit more. I want to lighten the overall image, and even a little bit further. And I'm watching my histogram, making sure I'm not losing information in my highlights or shadows. And then I want to head down and add some contrast in the tone curves again as well. And a lot of times once I make all those adjustments, I like to redo my white balance a little bit. I think I want to warm this up a little bit more. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And I'll do the same thing with the tint. Just kind of fine tune. The tint looks good. So now that I've got all that dialed in, let's take a look at before and after. Again, use the backward slash. You can see that's before and that's after. Much more dramatic, definitely more what I kind of envisioned in my head for what I wanted the image to look like. And there you go. Those are my 5 top tips in Lightroom to help improve your landscape photos. I hope you enjoyed these 5 tips. I'll be producing a lot more of these tutorials for both Lightroom and Photoshop in the future on my YouTube channel. So subscribe if you want to see any more content like this. I'm also going to be doing some vlog style videos and some fun adventure photo videos as well. And maybe some gear tech reviews on different tools that I'm using. And yeah, so subscribe if you want some more, like if you like the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.